This is Vasily Kandinsky's painting, Accented Corners number 247, 1923. Kandinsky was a Russian Jewish artist who started his career before the Russian Revolution, but was allowed by the communists in the early years to continue his painting in Russia, but soon chose to leave and move to France, which is where he lived when he painted this, which is an example of geometric abstract painting because it's composed primarily of shapes and colors and lines. There isn't any realistic objects in it. If you take a close look at a couple of details, there are people who might see, say, a banjo down here in the lower left, but that's not what the artist said it was, just vaguely similar to some people think to a banjo. Or here a battleship with the 16-inch guns on the deck of a major battleship. Again, not what the artist intended. All of these are just shapes, lines, and colors overlapping each other in an explosion of dynamic compositions. So his work was too radical for the communists after Lenin passed away, and that's one reason he left. And he's considered one of the first of all the geometric abstract painters in Europe, one of the earliest. He had been trained, like almost every other painter at that time, in realism, but he obviously abandoned that, and he became famous early on, along with Mondrian, whom we'll see in the next slide, as one of the pioneers of geometric abstract painting. Okay, for composition and now formal analysis, we can see a mixture of warm colors, the browns and reds and yellows, cool colors, the light and dark blue and gray areas, and then of course neutral with the black. There are bold lines and thin lines, but most of the lines are bold. Those you can see. It, as I just said, totally dynamic. There's not really a straight or right angle or straight line in it. For masses, that's just a lot harder to decide, but some people would consider the background almost looks like some kind of cheesecloth setting behind all of the geometric shapes. If that's one mass, that would be the largest mass, and then perhaps the largest triangle. Okay, and then we have the fact that it's got only one technique for space overlapping. There's no foreshortening or diminishing size because it's not trying to represent reality. And it's roughly balanced if you draw the line down the middle, left to right, or top to bottom, roughly equal areas or objects above and below those lines. So roughly balanced. And then we have textures. There really isn't much except possibly, again, that background that looks like sort of like cheesecloth. Some people think that constitutes simulated texture, but it is not mostly not meant to be any real object, so no simulated textures. Just a hint of them, and then there is modeling on that area as well, but nowhere else, so very minimal modeling is used. Okay. This next slide is The Dream by Max Beckmann, Beckmann, 1921. Max Beckmann was the most famous and successful of the German Expressionists painters, and he, before World War I, he had been a part of the Blue Rider school of painters in Germany and Austria. He was a German citizen, and he had been through World War I, so this was painted right after about 3 years after World War I ended, during the hyperinflation in Germany and the economic collapse that led to. And if those of you aren't familiar with that period, it was a pretty tough time to be middle or working class, let alone poor, in Germany, because the economy was in such bad shape that the amount of money that was required to go to a market and buy bread or milk, say 1 loaf of bread or a gallon of milk, was a wheelbarrow full of German marks. And then within a few days, you'd have to bring 2 wheelbarrows or higher denominations in a wheelbarrow full, and so forth. It finally led to economic collapse of the economy And so there was suffering from almost every level of German society, from the bottom all the way up to the upper middle classes. This painting depicts some of the suffering in that period of German history. Like the man on the ladder, he's a shopkeeper. Probably it looks almost like this might be his shop. He's carrying a fish, which indicates many folklore stories in Europe, including Germany, would say fish rot from the head down. And that's implying that the government, the leaders of Germany, are rotten and are allowing the people to suffer through this time. He looks like he's been beaten up. Perhaps it was vandalism and theft of his shop. Obviously, you can see both eyes are swollen and one hand is bandaged, or both hands are bandaged. Then over to the side on the left, on a platform, is a man who almost certainly is blind and probably begging for a living, playing some kind of musical instrument and an organ grinding machine, and of course undoubtedly homeless. Then below that man is a woman who's been physically abused, perhaps sexually abused. She's got no shoes on, as you can see, and her face is bruised and battered, and she's got her hand out. She's probably sitting on a trunk with all her worldly belongings, and perhaps she would be maybe related to the organ grinder, but it looks more like she's someone who escaped domestic abuse. Then there's the veteran, the man just with the purple, looks like pajamas, right, and bald head, and clearly he's had both legs shot off during the First World War. So he's a veteran who, back then, they had no VA or any system to help wounded or homeless or poor veterans. So he's on his own, probably also begging. And then the saddest image is the little girl down below, who's almost certainly been abused, perhaps even raped, and she is crying and just trying to hide out in the bottom corner. So it's an overall rather disturbing set of images of people suffering during this period of German history. So that is the emotional component that makes this an expressionist painting. Also the dynamic and vivid, imaginative composition, I should say, dynamic and imaginative. Clearly this whole thing is imaginative, imaginary, and of course it's dynamic. There's no straight lines in it. And then the colors are slightly exaggerated, at least on some of the details. And so this is a classic example of an expressionist painting by Germany's leading expressionist painter. It's balanced, as you can see, top to bottom and left to right with the placement of the figures. There's realistic simulated texture on the hair, the skin, the clothing. There's the rhythm of the human body parts and the various objects, like the beams on the ceiling and various wooden objects in the background behind the figures. The line is mostly thin outline. There might be some bold outline on the outer body parts of the man on the ladder, but most of the line's thin. Modeling is soft but realistic. And then for space, there's really only overlapping. I mean, maybe some, I see on the roof. You could say there is some foreshortening, or on the ceiling, I should say. But that's about it. Everything else, the only other technique in every other part of the painting for space is overlapping. Okay, so that's all of the notes for this one. Okay, this next painting is I and the Village. That's the pronoun I, by Marc Chagall, Chagall, 1911. Marc Chagall was a Russian Jewish painter who had a rather unique blend of expressionism and fantasy. Some people consider him the first famous fantasy painter. He certainly was one of the first famous painters from Russia. He was actually in the same generation as Kandinsky, but he actually grew up in the Jewish quarter, they called it, where Jews were expected to live in certain neighborhoods, ghettos. Actually, the word ghetto is originally a Jewish term. And yet in his village, which is where the title comes from, Jews and Christians were allowed to mingle, or at least to some degree, and got along with each other. So he actually had a more happy memory of his childhood, which is what this depicts. Growing up in actually it wasn't a small town, it was a medium-sized city between Moscow and St. Petersburg. And his parents are depicted in the upper right corner. You see his father with a scythe and his mother playing a violin. She's actually upside down in this image. Then she appears again milking the goat inside the head of the goat. And then the goat looking at a farmer who's clearly a Christian. You see the cross around his neck. And he's trying to arrange some kind of business deal or transaction with Marc Chagall's parents, who had a successful farm and raised animals for food and milk and cheese. So he wanted to get, apparently, the green-faced Christian farmer one of those goats, and he's offering something in his hand that actually is called the Tree of Life, but it's symbolic of wealth and prosperity. At least some people see it that way. In any case, there's some kind of business transaction that the farmer would like to conduct with the parents of Marc Chagall. But the most interesting detail maybe about his childhood memories is the village itself in the background. The upside-down houses, he said himself, Chagall said, those symbolize Jewish homes. The others, including, of course, a church with a cross and a priest's face in the doorway on the horizon there, those are the Christian houses and churches. So people in his village, at least some Jews, were allowed to live in neighborhoods mingled with Christians. So that's the main point here. He's, as you know, this is, of course, now fantasy style, and that movement is a movement of European painting, 20th century European painting. This is the definition now, in which artists portrayed their waking fantasies and memories. That's a school of painting that's different from surrealism. We'll get to surrealism in the next few slides, because it's not about subconscious. It's about waking thoughts and memories, which this clearly is. And he became, Chagall lived to be nearly 100 and became world famous. His stained glass windows that he designed, from his paintings for churches, synagogues, and mosques are on, I believe, every continent, anyway, many different countries on several continents. And he became a world-renowned artist, and he survived well past the end of World War II. He left Europe. He left Russia when he was a young man to move to France, and he left France before Hitler took over France and moved temporarily to the U.S., and then back to France, where he spent the rest of his life. So he's a rather major figure of 20th century painting, and his style, again, is a unique blend of expressionism, because of the emotions, right, and the bold, vivid, unreal colors, obviously dynamic and imaginative composition, with the definition I just gave of fantasy. It's both. It's a unique blend. Formal analysis, this is balance, clearly, when you see the roughly equal size of the heads of the green Christian farmer and the blue and white goat, and, of course, the tree of life in the middle and the village up above them. It's full of the rhythm of the repeated shapes of the houses, his parents, the eyes and mouths of the two close-up faces. Then there is modeling here. It's not very realistic, but it's clearly visible on the face of the green farmer. It's harder to say there is, at least not realistic modeling on the goat's head. But that's about it. So it's minimal modeling, and there isn't really any simulated texture. It's implied. The lines are almost all bold, of course. Obviously dynamic, as we covered. There are just almost no straight lines in this whole painting. The largest mass, well, that's hard to say. Maybe the farmer's face or the goat there. It's a close call. And then the tree of life, and then it would probably be the church in the background on the horizon. For space, there's only overlapping, no other technique. And the colors are warm, of course, on the red between the two large heads of the two main figures, cool on their faces, white and blue, of course, on the goat, and green and white on the farmer. And then the houses are mixed, obviously a mix of warm and cool colors, golds, greens, reds, and whites. This is Marcel Duchamp, or as my aunt in Indiana would have pronounced it, Duchamp, D-U-C-H-A-M-P. The title is Nude Descending a Staircase, number 2, 1912. Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp, was a French painter, and he is rather hard to categorize. Some consider him the first pop artist because he painted a mustache on a Mona Lisa copy he made, a copy of the original Mona Lisa, perfectly accurate and realistic copy, and then he adds a mustache and called it Mustache on the Mona Lisa. He also used urinals, which there is one at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art that was one of his original camp objects. And he just called it urinal, at least the ones I've seen. And he did that several times and gave them, sold them to different galleries and so forth. So he had a kind of iconoclastic or satirical, even sarcastic view of art in general, but he became world famous. And this is one of the first paintings he did that made him famous. It was shown in 1913 in New York when the first Cubist paintings by Picasso and other Expressionist painters. Picasso, of course, was, obviously, we already covered that, not an Expressionist, but the original Cubist. But Cubist and Expressionist paintings were at that exhibit in New York City in 1913 and shocked many Americans. They hadn't seen any of that kind of modern art before. This piece especially did, because it's of a woman supposedly nude, adult female, walking down the staircase. And so he's using the technique that some early photographers did of putting tripwires between two cameras placed in a row, so many feet apart. So wherever the person walked between the cameras, it would click the shutter and there'd be a photo of the person at that second, that moment. And then you put them together, create a montage, and you've got, maybe a photo montage. Well, perhaps he did that. I'm not certain if that's how he created this, but that was the concept. It's supposed to be her in almost like stop action. That's the phrase that most people would use, movement. A nude woman walking down the stairs. As you can see, there's, a bit of a indication of a head, a torso, hips, legs, and calves. You just don't see the feet, and perhaps the arms are also barely noticeable. So this has a Cubist quality, but it's not strictly just a Cubist painting. It's his kind of satirical take on that, because in Europe, Cubism, remember Picasso had done the first Cubist painting in 1906. It was like 6 years after that. So he had seen many Cubist works before he did this. So it has a quality of almost pop art, but that's not a movement yet, and no one used that term, so that definition we'll save until we get to actual pop art slides. Okay, so that's the main part of the meaning, and for formal analysis, it's mostly cool colors, because off-white and gray with a little bit of darker, almost black background, but there is some slight warm tones, as you can see, interspersed, kind of a light tan. It's dynamic. There's no straight lines in it. The lines are bold, mostly, around the edges of the stop-action figures. It's roughly balanced, left to right and top to bottom. There's no larger or smaller mass that I can see, unless you count the figure at the farthest to the right edge, as she reaches the bottom of the stairs, is looking slightly larger, perhaps you could, than the images of her behind her, because you can see more of her full length of her body. But really it looks almost like one mass to me. And the only technique for space here could be overlapping. You could look at it that way, but realistically there's nothing in the background that indicates a room or where the person is, anything clearly in a way. There's not really any modeling except very minimal hints of it, perhaps, on some little details, like maybe the figure slightly to the left of the last one looks almost like there's a little bit of modeling on the upper legs, but not really, and certainly not realistic. And there's no similar texture at all. And then that's about it for overlapping, if you want to call it that. It'd be the only technique for space. And everything else is pretty much abstract, almost as early Cubists would be, repeated shapes. So there's a lot of rhythm, of course, like all abstract Cubist style paintings would have had. Okay. This is Paul Klee, Klee, Twittering Machine, 1921. And it has nothing to do with tweets from the White House or anywhere else. This was a satirical look at the isolation and loneliness that modern urban society had created, now almost exactly 100 years ago. Both in Europe and the United States, both parts of the world had become predominantly urban for the first time. The majority of the population in most European countries and in the U.S. had moved to the cities by that time. And there was automation and factories, and of course a lot of people had moved to the city from the country and didn't know anyone. So when they moved to large urban areas, they often were isolated. And that may sound familiar at this point in our history, but it was a new phenomenon at that time. So Paul Klee was a German artist who decided that he should use his skill as almost a cartoon-like style, cartoonist type drawing, overlapping with Expressionism. So he was both unique kind of line drawing artist in a satirical cartoon type format, and also an expressionist painter. So this is a painting with line drawings of the detached heads of mechanical birds twittering away as a way of kind of alleviating the loneliness that a worker coming home from a factory to an empty apartment or empty house might feel. And so it could help him or her be less isolated. And of course, it's meant to be a complete satirical take on the fact that this is not real life. These are not real pets or real animals, let alone real human beings. And it's a substitution for what would have previous generations would have had. Of course, large families, extended families, multi-generations of families living under the same roof, and that was becoming less and less common already by the 1920s. So you see the crank there where the worker could come home and crank this machine and it could make him feel a little less lonely, supposedly. So Paul Klee had also, of course, the emotional quality and the very unreal colors of there's no real setting here. You can't see where it is, but it's supposed to be he wrote about this work among many others, so we know what he intended to convey, the meaning here, that this was not meant to be any specific place, but just any workers, at the end of a long day and coming home alone, domicile or residence, where they were alone. And this was their only companion. And of course the emotional component would be the sadness, maybe, of the loneliness of this new urban lifestyle, the isolation that it created. Okay, and of course this is formal elements. It's dynamic. There's hardly anything straight about it, maybe part of the handle of the crank itself, but everything else is diagonal curved lines. And of course the lines here are mostly bold except on the platform. That's supposed to be a metal platform at the bottom. The lines appear to be thin there. There is no modeling. There's no simulated texture. The only technique for space is overlapping. It's roughly balanced top to bottom, but weighted a bit towards the left. There's the rhythm of the mechanical bird heads and the wires. And the colors are mostly cool, which evokes the emotion, of course, of sadness, especially the blue in the majority of the background. So those are all the elements that in a painting by Paul Klee you can find. There are several at the Museum of Modern Art. There's a whole couple, I think it's 2 rooms of his drawings and paintings on display in the painting section of the Museum of Modern Art of San Francisco. Okay. This is Mondrian, Mondrian. Composition with red, blue, and yellow, 1930. As I mentioned on the previous slide of the Kandinsky accented corners slide, Kandinsky and Mondrian were two of the first geometric abstract painters. And this is a particularly evocative example of Mondrian's work. Mondrian became even more famous in areas around the world, especially North America, not just in Europe. Kandinsky was known outside of Europe, but he was most famous in Europe. Mondrian became more internationally famous because his works were so powerfully simple. Like this one here, it's only colors and lines. That's all there is on this particular composition. And it's typical of his geometric abstract work. He did hundreds of paintings like this, in which blocks of color alternated between warm and cool, and bold lines divided those blocks of color. He, like Kandinsky and most other artists back then, he was trained first in realism, and he learned how to paint realistic scenes, but he soon moved beyond that. And so by the 1910s, he was already doing, right after World War I, certainly by that time, in Holland, he was Dutch. He was doing these simple color compositions with alternating blocks of warm and cool color. Hitler hated this style of painting. He considered it degenerate. He actually had that phrase for any modern artist he didn't like. And Mondrian was smart enough to know that it wasn't a good time to stay in Holland when Hitler came to power. So he moved to New York City and spent the last several years of his life living in New York with a studio in Manhattan. And he was already well known here and became even more famous in the United States after moving here. He passed away just before the end of World War II. So that's pretty much the whole meaning. You can see some more of these at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. They purchased a couple of his late examples of this style of geometric abstract painting. And so what we have here is, for composition, bold outline, obviously, rhythm of the squares and rectangles. Warm dominates because the largest area is the red square and then a small yellow one in the lower left or lower right corner. But of course it alternates with the blue and white cool squares. But here's the thing that most people wouldn't notice when they look at this, at least at first glance, that the areas of warm and cool colors are balanced. In other words, the red, well, certainly the red itself, combined the total square area of the painting that is covered in red is equal to the areas covered in the outer squares or blocks of cool colors. So it has an actual balance in terms of warm and cool colors, but visually it looks weighted or unbalanced toward the top and to the right. Excuse me. There's no technique for space. There's no overlapping or any other space techniques. There's no simulated texture, just the real texture of the paint on canvas, I believe. Yes, he used canvases. So real textures only, no simulated textures, no modeling, and it is stable, and yet it feels dynamic because of the alternating effect of warm and cool colors, but technically it's completely stable. And then I already mentioned balance, and of course there is really only one large mass. That's the dominant mass is the red, and after that would probably be the white just below it, and then the other two whites, and then the blue in the lower left corner. Okay. This is the most famous painter of the Surrealist movement. And of course everyone probably knows his name is Dali, D-A-L-I. And the title of this one is The Persistence of Memory. And of course that's B-E-R-S-I-S-T-E-N-C-E. 1931. Salvador Dali was Spanish. He was a contemporary of Picasso's. very different. He used realistic detail in his paintings, but his paintings were surrealistic, not realistic. And that definition is a movement of 20th century European painting. It spread to North America eventually, but it started in Europe. 20th century movement of European painting in which artists portrayed their subconscious dreams and thoughts on the canvas. He mostly was using his own dreams, according to what he said about the meaning of his paintings. He would give some explanation in some paintings more than others, but he always left, or almost always, some mystery about some parts of, if not an entire set of details in any one of his paintings. For instance, this one. He explained what the melting watches meant. That was the relentless passage of time and the fact that we're all heading towards, obviously our own future deaths. I know it's not a pleasant thought, but he said himself he was obsessed with two topics in all his painting in his entire career: sex and death. And that shows in his work. So these melting watches are something he used in many, many paintings for many years. The pocket watch with ants crawling all over it is symbolic of the decay that affects all living creatures and eventually sets in when all living things die. And the barren tree, or tree trunk, is symbolic of the possibility of rebirth, or the cycle of life and death, because trees do bloom in the spring if they're still alive. But here it seems to be in the dormant phase. Now, this coastline is a realistic detail of the northern coast of Spain. In Catalonia, he lived in and around Barcelona. Well, actually not the city, but in his studio in northern Spain was at the northeastern section that's called Catalonia, where he spent most of his time. He did move to the U.S. for a while during the 1930s and 40s, and then moved back to Spain for the rest of his life. But the main mystery here is the object on the sand, assuming it's sand or beach. It's not clear what it is, and he never explained it. It could be his own face, some people think, because he had a mustache and prominent lips, and maybe a caricature of himself, or it could be flayed skin from some other dead animal or human, or it could be a dead sea creature washed up on the shore, or it even could be a used condom discarded on the beach. It could be any or all or none of the above. He never fully explained it. So that's where the mystery comes in. And perhaps in his dream he didn't know what it was. If he saw any objects like this, he just would wake up in the morning and jot down what he remembered from his dreams, and then eventually, if it was interesting enough, he'd work that into the themes and details or composition for his next painting. So, formal analysis, well, you've got realistic simulated textures here on that table, on the melting watches, the barren tree trunk, the shoreline, well, especially the hills in the background. And, of course, those have strong realistic modeling. That's actually everywhere in this painting. There's the obvious rhythm of the melting watches and the hills in the background and the ants, right? And whatever it is, a mustache, I guess, on the mysterious creature on the sand. And then it's mostly dynamic. There's a little bit of straight lines at the edge of that wooden table, I guess it is, and that metal plate in the upper left corner. But those are pretty minor parts. It's almost entirely dynamic, most of his paintings were. For space here, there may be scientific perspective, but things don't line up, so there probably isn't. The metal plate and the table don't line up correctly. And then we might see, some people think they see atmospheric perspective, but I don't really, if you look closely, it just fades into the sky, where maybe the water would be. It just pretty much blends right into the sky, so I don't think you can say that's used. So it's just foreshortening and overlapping and diminishing size are used here. And then we have thin outline around the objects. Of course, it's warm on the sand and the metal table and the pocket watch, cool on the mysterious dead creature, the watches, the barren tree, and the rocks, a mixture of warm and cool. The largest mass is the shore, or sand, and then I guess the table, the wooden table, and then that strange object in the middle. The rhythm is, we already mentioned that. Then let's see, that's pretty much the main compositional elements are realistic here. And strong modeling and realistic simulated texture, because that's what surrealism was all about. Realistic details but unrealistic compositions and themes. Okay. This is Frida Kahlo, and it's called Self-Portrait with Thorn Necklace, 1940. Frida Kahlo, of course, has now become the most famous artist from Mexico, or some would say even of all Latin American artists. But when she painted this, she was recently divorced from her husband, Diego Rivera, who at that time was the most famous artist from Latin America. We'll talk about him in the next slide. She had just, after many years of marriage and knowing that he hadn't been faithful to her, walked in one night on him and her sister in bed together in their own bedroom. And of course that's got to be the ultimate form of betrayal. So she immediately told him to leave and divorced him. So they were apart for, I think it was about 18 months, and that's when this painting was done. It shows her disillusion, depression, and sadness, of course, sense of loss over that incident. And it also has hints of hope for regaining the lost love between them. And those symbols are all around her. We start with the thorn necklace itself, which is a symbol taken from the life of Jesus when he was forced to wear a crown of thorns on his way to being crucified, according to the Bible. So that is around her neck, and you see blood coming out of the thorns. So that's a symbol of her pain, psychological and emotional pain. And then we have a black cat and a black monkey on her shoulders. Now she had pets, including several monkeys that she kept at her home where she did her painting. And so that would be one reference, the monkey, to one of the only people she would have after being divorced and now being alone. One of the only, I should say, living things that she had as a companion. But some people have pointed out that Mexican folklore often equates monkeys with evil and black cats with death. And those two things, of course, could have been on her mind at that time. So both of them are her companions, so to speak, literally on her back or on her shoulders. And then we have the symbols for hope. The hummingbird in Mexican folklore is unequivocally associated with hope for regaining lost love, which she did hope to reconcile with Diego. And indeed they did. I think within 6 months or a year, certainly, of this painting, they got back together and remarried. And then after that, they had, both of them agreed they would have an open marriage. In fact, during that period, as I mentioned before, Frida Kahlo had, after remarrying Diego Rivera, she had a pretty well-documented affair with George O'Keeffe. And also Leon Trotsky from Russia, who's an emigre that tried to escape from Stalin's secret police. So they had a brief affair as well in Mexico City after the reconciliation between Diego Rivera and her. But that was months away, and this painting, the disillusion, is what shows clearly on her face. And then we have the final symbol for hope, for better times, the butterflies and dragonflies flitting around the top of her head. Now, she was not a surrealist painter. That's how she's mischaracterized. And at the time, she was actively painting. Many critics called her a surrealist, and she hated that. She rejected that term because she was a, quote, fantasy painter. And that, the definition is, a movement of 20th century painting in which artists portray their waking thoughts and memories, from their own life, not their subconscious, in other words. That's what surrealism does, not their dreams. So she definitely was not a surrealist. She was a fantasy painter, and probably, now the most famous fantasy painter who ever lived. And this is, of course, formal analysis. It's super realistic. and that's something she always did with her paintings. Her style was realistic. You see the sharp, simulated textures on her hair, her skin, the thorn necklace, the cat, the monkey, the leaves, and also strong modeling and realistic modeling on all those objects. She's centered in the middle, so it is balanced left to right. You could make the case it's weighted toward the bottom because there's a little empty sky above the leaves behind her head. She's clearly the largest mass, and that's a close call. If you count the leaves behind her head, those would be the next largest mass. And then perhaps the cat and then the monkey, although they are almost the same size. And they are neutral in color, as is her black hair and her unibrow, where she didn't shave between her eyebrows, and the hummingbird. But her blouse, white blouse, and the green leaves behind her are cool, and of course her skin tones are warm. There's thin and bold outline in different parts of the painting. She always used those two types of outlines. You see a bold outline around the thorn necklace and thin around her face and neck. And then we have the rhythm, of course, of her eyes, ears, the butterflies, the thorn necklace, and so forth. It is mostly stable. She's upright, looking straight at us. And her neck and head are held straight upright. But there are a lot of dynamic details, of course, the thorn necklace, the leaves behind her, the tops of the monkey and the cat. So it's a mixture of the two. And finally, for space, we have really only overlapping. Some people see, I guess, a foreshortening in the back of the black cat that's arching its back up. But that's minimal, if at all. So really the only technique clearly present for space here is overlapping. Okay. This is Diego Rivera, Rivera, The Flower Carrier, 1935. And here we see the most famous painter from Latin America during his lifetime, and some would call him, many historians have called him, the greatest mural painter since the Renaissance. Some would say since Michelangelo. He's more famous for his murals on public spaces like walls and inside state legislature in Mexico City, or the national legislature, I should say, building, which always dealt with either history or social justice topics. He also painted murals here in the United States. There's several of them in San Francisco at the City College campus and a couple of other buildings in San Francisco, as well as some he painted back in the Midwest and the East Coast. But most of his murals were in Mexico. But this isn't a mural. In fact, it's at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. It's an easel painting on canvas depicting the plight of the poor peasant and working people of Mexico during the Great Depression. In the United States, the unemployment rate, there's been a lot of talk about that with the current unemployment problems of the coronavirus shutdowns. Some people think it'll reach the same level as we had then. Well, 25% is a figure I keep seeing in print, but you know what, that isn't quite accurate because there wasn't any way to count during the first 4 years of the Great Depression. There was no labor department. That wasn't created until Franklin Roosevelt became president, and from the first part of his first term on, you could get accurate counts. The unemployment rate is probably closer to a third, but in Mexico at that time, it was 2/3 or more. Some say 70% of the population. So here we have a couple obviously not working in any kind of job, but struggling to survive by selling flowers to tourists. Yes, there were still tourists. There was still a fair amount of middle class lifestyle left in the U.S. and parts of Europe where people could afford to go, probably on cruises, to Mexico. And so this couple, they're, obviously it's a husband and wife, and the wife is helping shift a huge, heavy load, basket full of flowers to go down to the port, probably in the port part of the coastal areas of Mexico, perhaps Veracruz or somewhere like that, or Cabo San Lucas, and go down to sell these flowers to tourists for just enough money, perhaps to feed themselves for maybe a week or whatever, short period of time, and then have to do it all over again. So he's straining, obviously groaning under the weight of this heavy load, and he's quite literally just trying to support himself with his hands. Now, Diego Rivera was famous for two techniques that he developed. One is the bold outline combined with the soft but realistic modeling of his main figures. You see that on both the man and the woman here, especially on the clothing. And then also stylized or exaggerated details on some parts of the human figures. For instance, his hands. Clearly those fingers are not meant to look strictly realistic like human hands would look. Almost more like some kind of large bird or something spreading its talons out. So he had those two techniques as signature motifs. But the main point, the third thing about him that is his main signature motif, is his themes. They were always about social justice or injustices, which were inflicted on the poor and peasants and working class, especially in Mexico. But actually, he felt all over the world. He was a communist, avowed communist, most of his adult life. So we see those themes here of social inequity or inequality and social justice, the need for social justice. He emphasized that in both his murals and his easel painting. And of course, you remember he was married to Frida Kahlo, and they had a rather stormy, contentious marriage, but they stayed together actually all the way up until she passed away in her late 40s, and he continued to speak lovingly of her long after he lived, several years after her. Excuse me. So this is formal elements now really well balanced. You see right across the middle the giant basket of flowers and the two figures on in either corner, the lower left and upper right. Largest mass is the basket of flowers. Then it looks like a close call between the wife, because you can't see all of her, and the husband. I already mentioned the modeling is soft but realistic on the clothing and their skin. And you could say so on the flowers. It's fairly sharp, though, on the sash and basket itself that he's carrying. And then we have overlapping. And I don't think I see any other technique for space here. And then we have the realistic simulated textures, which he did usually stick to on the basket itself. Excuse me again. The flowers. And to some degree on the clothing, though, it has kind of soft quality, but still realistic. It's mostly dynamic. There's really no straight lines in it. And then we have, of course, the rhythm of the feet, hands, legs, flowers, the basket. And the colors are warm, of course, on the basket, the flowers, and the sash, but cool mostly on the man's clothing and on the flowers, leaves and the tropical plants behind them. And the wife, it's a mixture, of course. There's skin tones, both of them are warm, and her dress is warm, and her blouse, I guess, or serape over her shoulders, it looks like it, are cool. And the lines are bold everywhere. Okay. This is Georgia O'Keeffe, and her last name is spelled O, capital O, of course, apostrophe, capital Keefe. Black Iris 3, 1926. So Georgia O'Keeffe was the first famous American woman painter in America, because remember, Mary Cassatt had to move to France to become famous. So the first famous American woman painter to become famous in her own country was Georgia O'Keeffe, and she was married for almost 30 years to the famous photographer Stieglitz. He was about 25 years older than her. They were both with someone else when they met. They left their partners and moved in together in his apartment in New York. And he was so famous already, as world famous as a photographer, that he was able to help her with her career. But she had the talent. He always said that. It wasn't that he gave her any special advantage. He just introduced her work to some of the curators at the museums. In fact, she was the first American woman to have any paintings in the Met in New York City, any of her paintings. So when she started out, she was influenced by his concept of closely cropped compositions. That's what you see here, but she developed it into a whole new art form herself. She painted a lot of details, like especially close-up views of flowers, like this one here, the title of which, again, is Black Iris 3. She painted dozens and dozens of these flowers, and some historians assume that they are a metaphor for the female sex organ, but she claimed that's not true. That's just in the mind of some viewers. So I guess you can decide for yourself. But she mostly wanted to show the beauty of different objects in nature. She did the same kind of closely cropped compositions with animals like ox skulls and details of landscapes in the Southwest when she moved to New Mexico after she separated and then divorced from Stieglitz. They lived together, like I said, for almost 30 years in New York State and the Northeast, and then she left him. By the way, she did have a well-documented brief affair with Frida Kahlo. In any case, this is one of her better-known versions of this closely cropped composition, but it's indicative of all of those close-up views of flowers, as you see the reproductive parts of it and then the petals surrounding it. And she was known for the soft but realistic modeling and soft but realistic symmetric textures. But by making the point that she managed to create this new concept, not just the composition itself, but by doing a closely cropped composition, it's both abstract and super realistic at the same time. The details are realistic, but when you first look at it, you don't know for sure what it is. It almost looks like an abstract painting. Okay, so it's balanced very carefully, obviously, left to right and top to bottom. It's warm only on the very interior part of the reproductive section of the flower. But all of the, the down below, that's, some think of it as almost a cool gray color, the petal that's facing downward. And the upper petals, the ones above that, definitely are cool. And then there really isn't much line. There's a little bit of line, visible thin line on just that one section of bluish tinted petals that are pointing upward toward the top of the painting. But everywhere else there really is no line. It's colors next to each other, but very realistic symmetric textures, and yet strong yet soft modeling on all the parts. It's full of the rhythm of the parts of the flower, the petals mostly. It's dynamic. There's nothing stable about it, and the only technique for space here is overlapping. And so that's it for this. This is Edward Hopper, Hopper, Night Hawks, one word, just like it sounds, 1942. Once again, this and the Black Iris 3, and I believe the Persistence of Memory. Anyway, these last two are definitely at the Chicago Art Institute, which I mentioned many, many times is a place you ought to visit if you go to Chicago and have enough, even a few hours of layover. To see some of the most famous world-class paintings of the last century and a half. So, Hopper was a social realist with an impressionistic overlapping into realist, not surrealist, but realist. Some parts of his paintings had realistic detail. In fact, the majority of them did. But there were always some kinds of impressionist sections or some areas that had impressionist techniques. He actually studied impressionism in Paris as a young art student at the turn of the last century. But he's mostly known for being more realistic, and that's where social realism comes in. That's a movement, a subcategory of American painting, which is similar to what Diego Rivera was doing in Mexico with his realism and his stylized, though it was, social justice. Here, though, it's not about particularly issues of social justice or injustice. With Hopper, it's more about the quality of life and the lifestyle or culture of American urban society in the mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century. He began painting in the 1920s and kept painting right on into the 50s, I believe, or even early 60s. For instance, this one, The Loneliness and Alienation, similar in that regard to the theme of Klay's Twittering Machine. Here we have what looks like a couple. Now, they're with each other, but they look like they aren't necessarily, dying of happiness. They're sort of kind of forlorn looking. And then we have a lonely man by himself at the other end of the counter, and then the soda jerk who has to work the midnight shift. I've done that. Anybody who's done midnight shifts where you're by yourself, you know how lonely that can be. And the streets are totally deserted. I mean, sounds familiar now again, but this is just a normal evening, late night or early morning, maybe the wee hours of the morning, scene in any big American city. It could be probably because he lived on the East Coast, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, most likely New York, where he spent more of his time than anywhere else. But it could be any big American city in the mid 1900s, late at night. The alienation, isolation, and loneliness of urban life were his themes. And then the realism part of his signature motifs, you see that in the entire interior of the night cafe. But on the street, you see mostly, especially with the sidewalk, the street itself, and the building across the street, at least some of the details around the window, frames, and some aspects of the I should say not out, but below the actual second-story windows, some of the storefronts have a rather impressionist feeling, as does the outside of the curved wall of the night cafe. But everything inside is realistic. He wants you to focus on that. Okay, it's balanced. Left to right, I would definitely say you could say that with the way the cafe itself cuts across the middle, and then the buildings across the street visually balance it roughly, left to right and top to bottom. And then we have the rhythm, of course, of the windows and the buildings across the street, of the human figures and the stools inside the night cafe. It's realistic cinematic texture and sharp and realistic modeling on, again, the interior scene. Most of the exterior details, though, are soft and diffused, like Impressionist paintings, on both the modeling and the cinematic texture. There isn't any sharp, bold outlines here, I wouldn't say. There is some line, of course, on the edge of the outer wall of the cafe, and at least on the outer edge of some of the figures. Looks mostly like the soda jerk against the background. Now here there's realistic detail for, realistic techniques for space. Overlapping, foreshortening, diminishing size, and I would certainly argue there is scientific perspective. Everything lines up correctly, but this is an urban scene and it's not far enough away to have atmospheric perspective. The colors are warm only on the counter and the upper wall across the street, the brick wall of those shops on the second floor. But everything else is cool. Sidewalk, the street, the outside wall of the shop, the interior white wall is mostly cool. And then the human figures, of course, they're wearing mostly cool outfits except the woman. And warm detail, or color, on their skin tones. And it is both stable and dynamic. The outer wall of the night cafe is dynamic, but the human figures mostly sitting upright, except the soda jerk leaning over. And the frames around the windows, both on the cafe and across the street, those are, of course, very stable lines. And the largest mass is the night cafe, and then probably the sidewalk, and then the building across the street. Okay. This is a very evocative painting called Tombstones, one word. Of course, that's T-O-M-B-S-T-O-N-E-S. Lawrence, Jacob Lawrence, L-A-W-R-E-N-C-E, 1942. He was also a social realist, but he was probably the first famous African-American painter to become famous in the broader culture, throughout the United States among art critics and historians and lovers of art. He lived in Harlem, and this is a scene that probably would have been a scene in Harlem or one of the segregated neighborhoods in New York City And during World War II, just as the previous war, World War I, literally millions of African Americans left the South from the discrimination and prejudice and lynchings they had to deal with there, to move to big cities in the North where at least they had a chance of getting, a little better life. But of course, they were almost all forced to live in a ghetto environment. And this depicts the, obvious dangers and harm done to the residents of neighborhoods like that, even those that are struggling to make their lives better and do things the right way. To quote Spike Lee, do the right thing. There's a shop selling tombstones. It's a booming business because there's plenty of early death that, of course, occurs from drug use, alcoholism, depression, suicide, and of course crime that some people resort to survive at that time in this kind of environment. But these people are all just trying to get by, doing their normal activities on a daily basis. We have a man with the green shirt, leaning on the railing, dead tired, coming home probably early in the morning from an all-night factory shift. During World War II, there were jobs at least available for a fair percentage of people moving, African-American families moving, or at least for the men, to the North, as there were here, in the Bay Area for the Richmond shipyards, as you may know about that, and here in New York as well. And then we have a mother who's got a baby in a baby carriage. The baby's dropped a doll. Of course, the doll's a white doll. They would make many black dolls back then. And she's comforting another child. Perhaps she is taking care of someone else's child. We have a woman who looks tired and worn out midway up the staircase. And then we have what looks to me like a minister. He often used things like ministers and other social leaders of cultural institutions like church figures in his paintings. And he's having a conversation with a woman in the window. Another woman's listening in, the one in the red dress, as well as apparently the one in the window. So it evokes just, an average day in a neighborhood with a lot of problems that people had to deal with every day. But people here are going about their normal businesses as best they can. And you notice his style in this is stylized. It's not super realistic. Excuse me. He was trained, again, like most painters then, in a realism style, but he chose to do this simplified and almost, some people say, cartoonish-like style that became his signature motif. And, of course, this is a social commentary on the, obvious prejudice and the effects of that on the population of a ghetto neighborhood like Harlem. He was hired by the White House, I believe it was Eleanor Roosevelt, but which she would have had to get her husband's permission, by the WPA to become one of the main artists to depict the history of African Americans. At that time it was called The History of the Negro in America. In a series of 12 paintings, that's what this is one of that series. And then one of the things I always like to mention when artists give back, and some do, some don't, this guy did. Jacob Lawrence, he became quite successful and lived well into the 70s, if not 80s. But sometime in the 60s or 70s, he gave money to an endowment, or helped create an endowment for teaching art to young African, well, they didn't just have to be African American, but largely were inner city kids in public school programs where there wasn't enough money to teach art. During whatever recession, I guess, of the 70s, there were a couple then, when budgets were being cut by school districts. So he gave back in that way. So hundreds, if not more than that, of young students, middle school, high school, maybe even college level, could have gone to one of these art programs that he helped fund from his success as an African-American artist. Okay, we see the colors here are mostly warm, except for the cool on, well, some parts of the windows and the staircase, but most of the rest of the colors are either cool or neutral black. And then there is only modeling on the staircase, no other modeling. And the silhouette textures, there is none. They are just implied. But the lines are bold. And, of course, the colors are somewhat vivid. Some would even call him a late expressionist because of that. The emotional component, of course, is, how life still people manage to overcome great odds, and the strength that demonstrates. in the midst of death and depression and poverty, people can still manage to overcome that despite all the great odds against them. And then we have, of course, this rhythm is powerful everywhere you see the staircase, of course, tombstones, but the people's bodies create great rhythm, and there's nothing stable about it. I don't see anything straight. It's all dynamic. It's roughly balanced left to right and top to bottom, but some would say it's weighted somewhat more toward the left because the staircase dominates that half. And then we have for space, the only technique really is overlapping. I don't even think the staircase really shows foreshortening. It's just overlapping. And the largest mass would be, well, depends on how you break it up, but probably the wall of the main building that they're all in front of, and then, of course, the staircase, and then perhaps the woman with the baby, and then the minister. Okay. This is Autumn Rhythm by Jackson Pollock, Pollock. Autumn Rhythm, of course that's Rhythm. Autumn Rhythm number 30 is the title. 1950. Jackson Pollock is often considered the greatest and certainly the most famous of the abstract expressionist painters. There was a time when he was considered the father of abstract expressionism by some critics, but actually it turns out there were other artists who were experimenting with this type of painting even a couple years before him, including his wife, Lee Krasner, I believe her name was. So he's one of the first, and he was the most successful and famous. And abstract expressionism was a movement of 20th century American painting in which artists gave free vent to their thoughts and emotions on the canvas. In other words, it was not a realistic style in any way or shape or form, and it didn't have any set guidelines the way geometric abstract did, of course, because those used colors and shapes that would repeat around the canvases, as we saw with Mondrian, right, and Kandinsky. This is different. This is a little later. It starts around the mid-1940s in America and spread, of course, to the whole world. You see it still being used today. Some people called him Jack the Dripper because he dripped paint off the end of his paintbrush onto his canvas, as well as splattered his canvases with paintbrushes and sometimes wooden sticks dipped in paint to create these free-form abstract expressionist compositions. This, for instance, with the fall color tone of the background, autumn colors, of course, it's named for that fact. It reflects a period when he was relatively stable and happy in his professional and personal life. He lived in a rural area of New York, well north of New York City, though he had started his career in New York City. And he had trained, like most artists at that time, as a realistic style painter. When he developed this style, he was touted by one of the main critics in the United States from the New York Times as the latest coming thing. So he was lucky enough to get an early exposure in mass media, like Life magazine did several articles on him. He was on the cover of Life magazine at least once. And his paintings were the first to sell for, 6 figures at least consistently. That was a lot of money in the 1950s. And so he had, alcoholism was pretty much chronic with him throughout his whole adult life, and chronic depression, bouts of that, meaning not manic depression or bipolar. He wasn't born with it, but he had severe depression for long periods of time, on and off throughout his career. And his wife finally got burned out on all that and left him and moved on to do her own painting by herself. And the saddest part of his story, it's in the movie Pollock, if you wanted to watch that for extra credit, for those students in my, any of my art history classes, and write what you learn about. But there's, I hate to say a spoiler alert here, so turn down the volume if you plan to watch it, but you could read this about him. After his wife left him, he sank into depression again. And the last day of his life, he was with his then girlfriend and her best friend. The two of these women were in his convertible, and the friend of Pollock's girlfriend could tell he was not only drunk but dangerous behind the wheel. She refused to get in, and he literally, grabbed her arm or pulled her into the car, took off, and I think it was around 80 miles an hour. He crashed that convertible. Remember, there were no seatbelts back then. In broad daylight, it wasn't raining, it was a warm time of the year, into a large tree and killed, I think it was him and his girlfriend, and permanently injured the passenger in the back seat. So he took an innocent person with him when he committed suicide. Obviously, that's what he was doing. So it was a sad ending to his once illustrious career. Okay, this is balance. That it does have. He would have had to give that some thought, even if most of the lines, and that's obvious, there are lines here, and the lines vary between thicknesses. There's some thin and some bold. But there's no technique for space. It's a real overlapping of different days. He would go back one day after another, maybe leave a painting for a while and then come back to it, where the paint overlaps the earlier layers. And that's, of course, not a technique for space. That's just part of the composition, the technique. It's dynamic, not a straight line in it. It's mostly warm colors, fall colors, with a little bit of cool white interspersed in the dark browns, and some people think they look black, so those would be neutral, the lines. But most of the background is, of course, a warm, soft brown, light brown color. And then we have, there's no larger or smaller masses here that you can pick out. There's no modeling. There's no simulated texture, only the real texture of the paint. And, of course, it's got rhythm, obviously. That's the whole point of the composition. Okay. Okay, this is by Mark Rothko. That's Rothko. Orange and Yellow is the title. 1956. Mark Rothko was the most famous of all the color field painters, which was a new type of abstract painting that developed in the mid-20th century, where blocks of color juxtaposed next to each other were the main components. He became by far the most influential, famous, successful of all color field painters during his lifetime. And during the early years of his career, his colors tended to be brighter, more warm and positive, like these here. But he was, manic depressive, as now people tend to say, bipolar, but he definitely had a birth condition of depression. It was genetic, and he struggled with it most of his adult life. So in his early years, he was successful enough that his paintings, like this one here, showed the more positive qualities of this style of painting. And of course, bright, warm colors tend to make people feel more upbeat, happy, positive, or optimistic even. And then his state of mind, one might say, deteriorated. In other words, he took a turn for the worst in his 60s. And sometime, I think just before his 70th birthday, when he was working on some new paintings in his studio for a one-man show or retrospective, I guess is the word, of his work at the, I believe, the Met in New York, one of the big New York museums where he lived and worked in New York City. He didn't show up, or people didn't see him for a few days, and finally, at some point, someone came to his studio and found him dead in his studio. He had committed suicide. So, those are some of the sadder stories in art history, but his work is very highly valued these days, and I don't mean just financially. His early work is usually more, desired by people in both collections of museums and, of course, whenever they come up for auction. His later work, which there are several of those, are the darker colors and much less optimistic in feeling, are in the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco. Owns a few of them. I think it's 2 or 3 of them. Okay, so what he did that was not just blocks of color, but look carefully at how the colors bleed into each other here. And the yellow, of course, almost overlaps on the far, the half of the blocks of color over towards the where they nearly meet, the orange and yellow, over towards the right side of the painting. So he used this soft kind of blending almost, or fading one color into another, is a very unique and individual signature motif that he did a lot of on whatever colors were in the blocks of colors that he used. And it makes the painting seem dynamic. So let's do a formal analysis now. This is balanced, if you want to call it, certainly left to right, but if you take the two blocks of color, the orange at the bottom is obviously the larger mass, and then the one above it, the yellow, and then the background in that order. There's no techniques for space here. Nothing even overlaps. There's no modeling. There's no simulated texture. This is an abstract painting, of course, but the colors are obviously warm. Salmon background, sort of pink, yellow, and orange. There's no line. None. It's just the edges of the color against the background, or colors. The rhythm is obvious. Very strong rhythms, not only in the blocks of color, but where the fuzzy sort of soft lines almost meet there on the right end of the two blocks between the yellow and the orange. So there is rhythm. And that makes it feel dynamic, but technically it's mostly stable because of the overall rectangular shapes of the blocks and the painting itself. Okay. This is Jasper Johns, his last name, Johns, Three Flags, 1958. Johns is often considered one of the first pop artists, and that's another mid to late 20th century American movement of American painting, I should say, in which the definition is that artists used objects from mass American culture to convey a social commentary of some kind. Sometimes satirically, sometimes sarcastically, sometimes just philosophically. Jasper Johns was a veteran. I can't remember whether it's a World War II or Korean War veteran, but he definitely had been in the military. So that's an important detail, because this particular painting, believe it or not, was controversial when it was first viewed by the public and whatever museum or gallery show it was first seen. This would be, the period of the Cold War and the struggle between communism and freedom, quote unquote, the West, and of course the socialist East bloc of countries under Soviet and Chinese domination. So it's part of the reason it got this kind of criticism. Supposedly it was being, quote unquote, some veterans group said this, disrespectful of the American flag, because he was painting three different flags without having any context, and just trying to make a career, a name for himself off of using the flag to promote his career, and not respectfully, which seems ludicrous now to think that way, but they actually got protests in some of the cities where this painting and others like it that he did were shown. He wasn't thinking anything disrespectful. When he was asked what he was thinking of, why he created this, he was just saying, well, the flag is, besides being a symbol of our country and a political symbol, it's also an object, an art object. It's a composition. It has lines and colors and rhythm, and he's just focusing on that aspect of how flags look. You've got three flags painted, one on top of the other, in which he creates the illusion of actual canvases stacked on top of each other. He actually did do that too with a different version of this painting from what I've read, but here he was painting that to give the illusion of how he might have taken three descending sizes of canvases and glued them on top of each other. Just the act of gluing them onto each other, I guess, was upsetting to some people. But he eventually got past the criticism, and when he explained his work, a majority of at least critics and art historians and curators not only accepted his work but applauded it, and he became quite successful. In fact, he lived, I'm not certain, but I think he lived until very recently. He had a long career. So let's do the formal analysis. It's roughly balanced. That depends on how you look at it. Certainly the blue field with the white stars is only about a quarter of the total, and if you consider that, weighting it, perhaps to the upper left side, then it might be unbalanced to that side. But if you take the red and white stripes, they're a majority of the composition, then you could say it's unbalanced or weighted toward the lower right side. Obviously, it's full of rhythm, the stars and stripes, literally. And there are warm colors, obviously, and cool. The cool are the white and blue, of course, and the red are the warm colors. There is no line per se, but the stripes form visual lines. There's no outline here. And the only technique for space is overlapping. The flags overlap each other. The largest mass, pretty easy. The bottom flag, the largest one, then the middle one, and then the smallest one on top. It is mostly stable, but it somewhat, to many people, appears to be somewhat dynamic because of the way the flags come out towards us as we look at them in ascending order, one on top of the other. And then, of course, the stars can be considered dynamic, although the stripes are stable, so it's got some of both. Then again, there's no modeling except underneath. Well, there is actually just that. Underneath the bottom of the two upper flags, there is the illusion of shadows to make them look like they're three-dimensional. Otherwise, there's no modeling and no simulated texture, just the texture of the paint on the canvas. Okay. This next slide is by the most famous pop artist of all time, and it's Gold Marilyn, just like it sounds. Gold Marilyn Warhol, as many of you know, his first name was Andy, W-A-R-H-O-L, 1962. This, of course, is I should just say his main technique for painting portraits, which he did as a pop artist. He was making a commentary on mass consumer culture and, film and music. He did some of Elvis Presley, repeated images of Elvis Presley in one of his movies, and then also of Elizabeth Taylor. And here, I think he did more than one version of Marilyn Monroe. This was done the year that she actually died, where she had committed suicide with a drug overdose. But I believe it was completed before that. In any case, he didn't know her. There was a time when at least some people speculated they knew each other. But he knew about her, private pain, if you want to say it that way. But many people knew she had had 4 unhappy, unsuccessful marriages within a short time, all ending in divorce. So that was common knowledge. But the fact that she was, quote, sex goddess, unquote, made many people assume that she must be happy, and obviously she was earning good income from her starring roles in many Hollywood films that were very popular. But she was not a happy person, and she had a mother who was manic depressive. She never knew her father. When she grew up, they had no regular home life as a child and adolescent. And so she went to Hollywood to try and find acceptance, from mass audiences, which she couldn't find from her own personal life. And he knew that about her and knew enough about her personal pain to indicate it. This is a brilliant piece of sort of evoking the inner feelings by the details on a person's face, their inner thoughts and emotions, which goes all the way back to Da Vinci. For those of you who took art 1.2 or 2.2, Da Vinci's the first famous artist to do that. With either body language or expressions on the face of his main figures in his paintings, he would convey their inner thoughts and feelings. So that's a long tradition. But he does it, Warhol, very differently. First, he gives the background is gold. It's, sort of mottled, but it's a gold color, and of course, the title tells us that. That makes her an icon. Literally, that's what icons had all the way since ancient Byzantine times. Sacred image with a gold background, that's the definition of icon originally. And so she's made into an icon here, and then he emphasizes her, of course, dyed platinum blonde hair. But what he really does is capture her sadness by using just a brilliant little touch of blue right above her eyelids, or on her eyelids, right above her eyes. And even her smile is a little bit off, a little crooked if you look at it closely, and he emphasizes that aspect of her inner feelings of presenting a brave front to the public while feeling such depression and sadness inside, by emphasizing the redness of her lips. This was a very popular painting, and right after she died, of course, it became even more well-known and reproduced. And so Marilyn Monroe was someone he saw as a victim of mass culture, and some people wouldn't think of her that way, and certainly at the time very few did. But in retrospect, many people would have to say she kind of got her personal life completely taken over by the Hollywood publicity machine, and that, of course, leads usually to addiction and self-medication and depression and sometimes suicide. Okay, so formal analysis, it's roughly balanced left to right, but she is above the middle, so you could say it's weighted toward the top. There is modeling here because it's a silk screen. That's the technique I was trying to remember that he used on his paintings. From a photo of her, a recent photo that had been taken, probably within the last several months before she died and before he did this work. She died in August of 1962. I remember because my grandmother cried when she heard the news. She really liked Marilyn Monroe, as did many people. Anyway, so you have here modeling around her, of course, her hair, her face, and there is some added texture, of course, because of it being a photo in the hair and on the face. There's a little hint of some in the scarf, the blue scarf behind her neck there. And then we have the rhythm of the eyes, the hair, of course, the lips. It is mostly, well, it's both stable and dynamic. Her head is upright, and she's positioned, near the middle or in the middle with a box around her, an outline around her. That is obviously all straight lines. But there obviously are dynamic details, as with all human faces, mostly in the hair and to some degree the eyebrows and the lips. But it's as much stable because of the pose or positioning, upright position of her head and neck. And then there really is only one mass, or you could say there's two, her and then the scarf. The only technique for space here is overlapping, the scarf overlapping her neck. And then the warm colors of the hair, obviously the gold and the red lips contrast with the, well, strange, almost purplish, pinkish purple color of her skin. And then, of course, the blue of her eyes and scarf and the white of her teeth are cool. The background, though, is entirely warm, so it's mostly a warm composition. And here there is that line around her face, the box in which your face is shown, and, of course, visual line around her features on her face. Okay. This next slide is Woman 2, Roman numeral 2, and the artist's name is D. Kooning. That's a two-word last name. He was Dutch. Capital D-E, capital K-O-O-N-I-N-G, 1952. D. Kooning was one of the two most famous and certainly one of the two most successful of abstract expressionist painters, along with Jackson Pollock, whom he knew and was friends with. But de Kooning lived way beyond I think Pollock died in his early 50s or something around that age. De Kooning lived to be into his 90s. Only not that many years ago he passed away, around the turn of the century. His work was controversial, partly because of it being early versions of abstract expressionism, but he did have some imagery that, like in this one, for instance, did relate to real things in the real world. For instance, this is a rather somewhat heavy woman who's looking at us with what some think is a mask, and others think it's the supposedly misogynist view that some people accuse de Kooning of having of women in general, that they're, quote, two-faced, or that they hide an evil nature underneath a mask, and that maybe here she is unmasked. She's sitting, it looks like she's sitting, right, with something on her lap. Could be a book, could be a bouquet of flowers. There are different interpretations. In her arms, somewhat what you can see of them here, abstract though they are. If you call those arms, they look like the lower half of her arms are folded across her lap. And then you see her dress, right? Her head, of course, and eyes and mouth, and then some abstract lines in the background. So this is abstract expressionism, but he claimed it had nothing to do with a negative view of women because he did a series of men also. called Man 1, 2, 3, a series of such paintings where he showed the same kinds of strange features on the face of the male figures he painted. So that, plus the fact that he had a pretty stable home life. The last I recall reading, he had a wife and I think at least 1 or 2 daughters, and they never said he had any misogynist tendency. So probably that's just critics interpreting things, as often happens, on their own without any real evidence. But there was still some controversy about how some of these images might have been used by, other people to make negative comments about people who are two-faced or duplicitous or evil underneath their mask. But that, he said, could apply, if one wants to see his work that way, to both men and women equally. Okay, and so you see how it's abstract and it's expressing his view of human nature, which might seem extremely depressing, but he himself wasn't a depressive person. He didn't have any depression illnesses or chronic depression. As far as I know, I don't think he was an alcoholic, but he was a very successful and long-lived artist and famous for his work. Okay, this is balanced roughly, left to right. You could make the cases weighted toward the bottom because her head is near the top, and around behind her are just lines and colors. So if you call that empty space, then you'd have to say it's weighted toward the bottom. Roughly balanced left to right. There's obviously the rhythm of her breasts and her face, the 2 eyes, and what there is you can see of the arms. It does look like, to me, books on her lap the more I look at it, but no one I've read has said that's definitely the objects. But those somewhat rectangular shapes on her lap create rhythm as well. It's dynamic. There's not a single straight line anywhere in it. There's some modeling on the face, but that's about it, so it's minimal modeling. Line here is rather roughly drawn, a little bit around her shoulders, her dress, the top of her dress, and to some extent her lower arms, though the sides of her upper arms don't really have outlines. So there's a little bit of outline used, and those lines are mostly bold and roughly drawn. There's no semi-added texture, none. For space, you just have overlapping, the dress overlapping her upper body, and then those 2 objects, I guess books, on her lap. And then she's the largest mass, and then the objects on her lap, and those are the only objects here, of course. And the rhythm is obvious, the repeated shapes of the eyes and the arms and hands and the 2 objects on her lap. And the colors, mostly cool, almost all cool, except for the top part of her dress, and again, those 2 objects that look like books. And some of the background has yellow, but most of that is blue and white, as is the rest of her body, so it's primarily a cool composition. Okay. This next and second to last slide is New Shoes for H. The artist's name is H, the letter H period. Eddy, his last name, Eddy, 1974. And this is photorealism, it was called. It was very popular in the late 60s through the early mid-80s, but particularly in the 70s it reached a peak of popularity. Excuse me. And Eddy was, I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Eddy was definitely one of the most successful and well-known practitioners of photorealism. What they really are is montages of photos from a variety of sources of real objects in real space that then are overlapped and create a very dynamic and unusual and even arresting or intriguing image of different objects. For instance, this is a shoe store window, so you could say, well, it's just reflecting the objects across the street, the cars that are parked in front of the store and the loan shop, I guess it is, across the street. And by the way, he worked in the Bay Area primarily. A lot of his paintings are set in Oakland and San Francisco, as this might be, but although he didn't always identify where his paintings were. So here we see, typical cars from the 70s that were reasonably new at the time, and whatever the stylish shoes of those eras were, some tennis shoes and women's shoes, and various kinds of slippers and things that would be for sale in a typical American shoe shop. There's not really any deeper meaning to it than that. And this is the kind of painting that often was used to, some think of it as an offshoot of pop art because it's almost always used to emphasize or highlight mass-produced objects in mainstream American culture. This is balanced. I would call it balanced. The car sort of dominates the middle, and the shoes are arranged pretty much all the way around the edge. So it's roughly balanced left to right and top to bottom. It's got realistic symmetric texture on the cars, reflections, I should say, from the window, and the shoes inside the window, and the bricks of the wall beneath the window. It's all sharp and realistic detailing on the symmetric texture, and strong realistic modeling on all the parts. For here you have overlapping foreshortening and diminishing size for perspectives. I wouldn't say there's no scientific perspective. It's a photo montage. And I don't see atmospheric perspective unless you count the tops of trees behind the shop across the street. If you did that, could be a little bit of atmospheric perspective. Lines are sharp and thin outlines around the main objects, mostly the shoes. And it is both stable and dynamic. The cars mostly are at right angles, except for their hoods, their grills and the wheels. And the shop across the street, including the sign, the loans sign, those are stable, straight lines. But the shoes are all dynamic, so it's a mixture, probably more dynamic than stable. The rhythm is obvious with repeated shapes of the shoes and the cars and the shop across the street, the windows of it, and the tops of some of the trees. Colors mixed between warm and cool. Of course, warm pink on many of the women and browns on many of the women's shoes, and white and blue on some of the tennis shoes and slippers. And then the cars, well, you see the main car you see in the middle, the largest reflecting car is blue. It's cool, and the one next to it is tan, looks like tannish, like tan color. And of course the shop across the street is got a combination of reds and tans on the sign and the roof of it, so it's a mixture of warm and cool. And here there's no actual bold outlines, but there are those thin lines we mentioned. And the modeling, I already said, is strong, but especially underneath the grill of the car, the blue car in the middle. Otherwise, it's soft and muted. Okay. This last slide is one we talked about the first week of class when we discussed the meaning of what is art. Holy Virgin Mary is the title. Ofili, the artist name, O-F-I-L-I, 1996. This was one of the two most controversial objects in that exhibit we talked about the first week of class, called Sensation, that had started in London and then moved to the Brooklyn Museum of Art in New York City. And Mayor Giuliani, the mayor at that time, and was, of course, mayor later on during 9/11, conservative Republican, chose to single this out as an offensive work and thought it shouldn't be on display in a publicly funded museum. We talked about that issue. So it got a lot of attention because of that. But the artist explained that what was the controversy, I should say what Giuliani and some more devout, especially Catholic but other Christian groups and spokespersons said is offensive, was that it shows the mother of Jesus, one of the most holy figures to the Christian religion, with dried elephant dung stuck on and or glued to her robes and around her head. And that is what that is. It's dried elephant dung. That some of it's painted even and then adhered by glue to some parts of the painting. Well, the artist himself explained that. First of all, he was a devout Catholic. At least he had been raised that way. I don't know if he was when he painted this, but he had moved with his parents from Nigeria, where he was raised in the Christian half of Nigeria. It's roughly half Christian, half Muslim, that country, by Catholic, devout, observing Catholic parents, and then moved to London, where he established, after finishing school, he established his art career. And he said that elephant dung in Nigerian folk culture is not only not disrespectful, it's a symbol of the cycle of life, and Mary's the ultimate example of that, how she willingly accepted the death, a painful death and execution of her son, and even witnessed it at the hands of the Romans, because that's what, quote, God wanted or willed it to be, unquote. so that he could help people find, quote, again, according to Christian religion, salvation through belief in him and an afterlife. So that fits. It tracks with what some of the reporters who covered the controversy and his comments checked and saw that he was correctly describing the use of elephant dung in many traditional Nigerian works of art. So that controversy eventually died out, and this painting helped establish, as you can imagine, the reputation of Chris, his name was Chris Ofili, all over the United States. And there are works of his in many major museums, including one of his paintings at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco that you can go see when those museums open up again. Okay, so formal elements here. Well, obviously you've got cool blue on a robe, which is the color of royalty, and that's traditional color since the Renaissance that Mary's robes were painted, meaning she's, quote, the Queen of Heaven, unquote. So that's very much in tradition with Christian teaching and art history. And then she's shown as an African woman. Well, he's from Africa, and there are tens of millions, in fact, hundreds of millions of Christians in Africa. Excuse me. So that wasn't controversial. That wasn't something anybody was complaining about in the year 2000 in New York City. Certainly not. That wasn't any reason that people objected to it. So those are warm skin tones, of course. And then around her is the gold color of like an icon would be, of course, including rays of divine light coming up from behind her head. All of which are traditional techniques of Christian art since, again, the late Middle Ages even. And then there's the similar textures of her face and her robes. They're minimal. There's not much, and there's no modeling. But there's the real texture of the dried elephant dung. It's in more than one or two places here if you look around. The purple objects around her head, and then the main one that's on, it looks like it's on her skin, but it's between the two parts of her blue robe at about chest level. That's the largest of those applied objects with real textures. So there's minimal semi-texture, no modeling, and some real textures. It's dynamic. There's not a straight line in it. She's the main object, and then the dried elephant dung would be the second largest masses. They're roughly the same size, the larger ones. And then we have the rhythm, of course, of her eyes and her robe, and the dried elephant dung, and the rays of divine light coming from behind her all create strong rhythm. There is bold outline, but it's done with a gold coloring around her robes and her head, not black, as bold outline usually is. And that's about it. There really isn't much other line. Well, there's some around her nose. And then we have her balanced roughly left to right, but weighted toward the bottom. And the only technique for space here is overlapping. Her robes overlap her body. Well, as I already mentioned, the elephant dung overlaps some parts of her. One, at least, piece here overlaps her body, and the rest are overlapping the background. Okay. This is actually the last slide. I am just adding it, though it's on the original syllabus for those of you taking 2.3 art at Santa Rosa JC. You'll see it there. But it'll be our last in the order presentation here. Okay, Bartlett, B-A-R-T-L-E-T-T, Water, the title, just one word, Water, 1990. Jennifer Bartlett is one of the most successful female painters of the last 40 or so years. She's been painting at least since the 80s. Her paintings are on the walls of major buildings around the world, including UNESCO headquarters, I believe it's the headquarters in Paris, the Volvo headquarters in Stockholm, I believe it's Stockholm, Sweden, and in private collections and museums all over Europe and the United States. She's what our last new definition now, what you would call a postmodern painting. And postmodernism is a movement of art in which a variety of colors, textures, materials, and forms are reintroduced into the painting or whatever it is. Postmodernism is not only a painting movement, but it's all visual arts have had the effect of that. One good example is on the Santa Rosa JC campus, the cafeteria student event building, right, where most students eat lunch, at least many. Look at the outside of it and you'll see decorative details that would never have been used during the late modern period of the last half of the 20th century, or up until at least about 1985 or so, because it wasn't until the 80s that this movement began influencing architecture and painting. Late 70s in Europe and early 80s in America. So Jennifer Bartlett was one of the most, or is still one of the most prominent of all postmodern American painters. Here, her theme has to do with choices and dangers or risks of risky behavior. What you see is what looks like an idyllic summer day picnic scene on a lily pond, and that, of course, would be, in many people estimate, is inspired by the water lily paintings by Monet. And she had certainly studied them before she began her career. And those, of course, are peaceful, idyllic, happy, scenes that induce happy feelings. Not so here. If we look closely, we see various objects that indicate games of chance. We see dominoes and mahjong tiles lined up across the middle, and actually playing cards in the upper, or near just where the red open box is. And then, speaking of that area, you notice a skeletal foot and the majority of a human skeleton across the entire lower half of the painting. Now, what could that symbolize? Well, it would be a cautionary note, as many historians have pointed out, by the artist, and she herself also, is saying, if you engage in chancy or risky behavior, addictions of any kind, gambling, of course, that's an obvious reference, but that also could include, unprotected sex, or addictions, drug or alcohol addictions, or violent, perhaps, behavior, or even not social distancing enough during this period we're living through. Any of those things are risky behaviors. You're gambling with your life. And the result could be you'll thin out, to use a line from a Woody Allen movie. That particular skeleton, of course, could be symbolic of anyone who took too many chances in their life and then ended up dying because of their careless behavior or their addictions to dangerous activities. Now, there's the signs of hope in this painting, too, because she is, last I read about her, she was a devout Christian when she painted this, for certain. And you see two crosses, slightly modified in the upper left corner, and more traditional, sort of medieval version of a Christian cross just below that over the water lilies on the left side of the painting. And the other symbol for hope is Pandora's box. The chest that opens is not just a picnic basket. Obviously, there was some hint at a picnic happening here with, the tablecloth, the checkered tablecloth in the lower right corner, before the skeleton so rudely intruded upon the peaceful enjoyment of whatever family it was that might have been coming out here in this pond area for a picnic, and suddenly has it disrupted by a skeleton popping up out of the water. The Pandora's box, of course, is a well-known. Many of you have heard that, right? The myth, the Greek myth, that Pandora opened a box and let all of the evils of the human race escape and plagued the human race ever since. But at the bottom was one last little spirit, hope. So she, the artist, is saying there is hope if you have faith in something beyond yourself to overcome your addictions or your self-destructive behavior, and reform, if you want to say it that way, or change that behavior in time. It won't cost you your life. Okay, this is typical of the postmodern style of painting, in that you see details here. This is realistic. Although it's loosely painted, it's actually a study for the final painting. That's what was available in the files I searched. The details on the skeleton, the box, the games of chance, and the picnic cloth or blankets are definitely sharper in the actual finished painting. But even here you can see realistic cinematic texture and detail, even if it's a little bit rough and unfinished, and definitely strong realistic modeling and recognizable objects everywhere, and of course a variety of colors and shapes and textures and rhythms in this. So we have lots of rhythm. Formal analysis now is rhythm everywhere. I mean, with the water lilies, the games of chance, the parts of the skeletons, bones, and then of course the two crosses. We have only overlapping for space, that's all. It's roughly balanced with the objects in each corner. You know, the torso or rib cage of the skeleton in one corner, modified cross in another, Pandora's box in yet the next, and then at the bottom lower right corner is, of course, part of what was a picnic cloth that you see with a Scottish pattern on it. And then we have line is mostly thin. It seems to be slightly thick on one of the two skeleton's legs, but mostly it's thin. And then we have colors. It's cool on the background, warm on the skeleton, the open Pandora's box, and the two crosses. So it's a mixture. The largest object would be the skeleton, as it's meant to be, to grab your attention. And then some of the other objects, I guess Pandora's box, yes, would be the second largest, and then that vase or urn, that blue urn, and then after that the fragment of a picnic blanket. And then we have stable or dynamic. Well, it's almost entirely dynamic. There's only a little bit of a straight quality to the corners of Pandora's box and to some of the cards, or dominoes, I should say, across the middle. But even many of them are at diagonals, and everything else is dynamic. Okay. Oh, and it's, roughly balanced, as I said earlier. All right.